Okay, I think that we're going to get going here, and we'll invite our panelists to join in. And I just wanted to say thank you for joining us today. My name is Amy Ford. I'm the director of the Mobility on Demand Alliance with ITS America. And we at SAE wanted to pull together a webinar, and this was born of some just updates that we were talking about how we define new mobility and how we define mobility on demand and mobility as a service and what it means when you start establishing those standards. And obviously SAE has been leading in this effort, and today and one day only we are literally pulling together all of the efforts that SAE has been doing in this space, which are many and varied and are really helping to completely shape how we think and talk about new mobility and mobility on demand. And so we're happy that you all joined us today. I'm going to turn it over to Annie so she can introduce all of our panelists and our discussions to say a couple of comments and just notes before we get going on the logistics. 1,000 times you all have done this now with Zoom, but I want to note, because we have so many panelists, that you can always take your screen, and if you push your arrow bar and your cursor over the middle, you're going to see a line go into the screen. Shifting it over a little bit so you'll be able to see all of the panelists as they are sitting and talking, just to give you more of a better view of all of our smiling faces. And then also, we absolutely are engaging Q&A with this discussion and how these standards are being used and implemented. And so please do jump in and ask those, and we will certainly have a few engagement opportunities with our panelists as well. So Annie.
All right, thank you so much for hosting this to Amy and team at ITS America. So I think we can move to the next slide. Essentially, we're going to be covering a huge variety of work that we've been doing at SAE in the new mobility portfolio. And as you can see, we have a powerhouse of speakers here. I think these are hands down the superstars of the new mobility industry. So I am very grateful for everyone's time and effort to pull this together. Next slide, please. So these are our speakers. We have academia, we have industry, we have data platforms, and we have from consulting agencies as well. So we will do introductions briefly as we move forward and progress in the webinar. Next slide. So our motivation at SAE to carry out this work is really to answer these questions. First of all, what on earth is new mobility? How do we regulate these things? How can we ensure the safety of these new modes and efficiency and make sure they're interoperable and playing nicely together with the broader mobility ecosystem? And how can we all work together to achieve the outcomes that we've been looking forward to in advancing our mobility ecosystem? Next slide. So first, I wanted to start off with our standards portfolio. So this occurs in our traditional standards development committees, and they're driven by volunteers. Next. So a standard in its simplest form can be understood as an agreed upon way of doing things. As you know, you may know SAE has the levels of automation for vehicles, and that is one of our very popular standards. So we've been trying to apply the same logic in the new mobility ecosystem, which is evolving very quickly, and we have evolved the way that we are standardizing to meet the demand of the new industry. Next slide. So here I'd like to ask Sabrina Susman from ZipCar, who is the chair of the Shared and Digital Mobility Committee, to walk us through. Sabrina?
Thanks so much, Annie. And let me just take a moment to say thank you to Amy Ford and the entire ITS America team, especially Rachel and Elizabeth. You know, I, at one point in my career, worked at ITS America, and so this feels like a little bit of a homecoming. So thank you for pulling this together. And Annie, thank you for really bringing together such an incredible slate of speakers. I'm honored to be a part of it. As Annie said, my name is Sabrina Susman, and in addition to working at ZipCar, I am the chair of the SAE Shared and Digital Mobility Committee. That's a position that's elected by a group of members of the committee, and we really are just kicking off again for this year, and so I'm pretty honored to serve in that role. The committee is really meant to bring together a community of operators, manufacturers, regulators, and researchers to have these difficult discussions about how do we set standards for what feels like a part of the industry that changes every 24 hours. You know, one of the things I think that's particularly unique about shared and digital mobility is that we can see industry shifts every time an app updates in the App Store. And that is a dramatic change from decades and decades of infrastructure that we know to be slow moving. And so working with a standard setting body is incredibly challenging, but also rewarding as you look and see changes happen every single day. So the Shared and Digital Mobility Committee is relaunching our membership this summer. If folks are interested in that membership, feel free to reach out to me. If you can move to the next slide. The committee is really focused on advancing the field of shared and digital mobility through developing some of the baseline fundamental questions that we happen to know a little bit more about for other parts of the industry. So number one, most importantly, how do we create a common language? What does it mean when we say car sharing? What does it mean when we say micromobility? Some of those terms have become both press lexicon, casual lexicon, but we as industry experts have to ensure that we're maintaining integrity around what those definitions mean. We're working to harmonize our global markets, ensuring that what's happening across the globe in such an interconnected world continues to work hand in hand. And then of course, we're working to facilitate interoperability. Standards are important not just because it's a common language, but because as we continue to rely on technological innovation to ensure that platforms can not only speak to each other, but really rely on each other moving forward. So the committee is coming together to really focus on this. One of the documents I'm most proud of the committee's history prior to me becoming chair was a common definition language that Dr. Susan Shaheen really helped lead. And so with that, perhaps I'll pass it off to Susan.
Thanks so much, Sabrina. And I also wanted to chime in and thank Amy for pulling us all together in this fabulous webinar. And of course, Annie, for your tireless leadership and the expansion of a whole family of standards that essentially started with the one that I'm going to introduce right now. So we started with the J3163 Standard, and this focuses on a taxonomy of these definitions that help us understand exactly what we're talking about. And this guides us in standard making, but also in policy making. And I led the document development with Adam Cohen. Next slide, please. All right, so with shared mobility, I'm sure most of you on the webinar today realize things are evolving almost every quarter in this particular space. So given that we have basically a philosophy towards evolution with respect to this taxonomy, so it is undergoing developments and modifications to improve it. In this round, we are making some additions, including adding mobility on demand and mobility as a service. We're updating and refining existing definitions and reorganizing the structure of the document to make it a bit more user-friendly, particularly for policymakers who may be wanting to insert some of these definitions into policy. And we're also adding other forms of shared mobility, and that's why we're gaining an A in front of the J3163. We're adding urban air mobility, and so A stands for air. And we're also adding water taxis. And so our anticipated publication for the revised standard is Q4 of 2020. So with that, I am going to turn it back, I believe, to Sabrina, and I'm happy to answer any questions later in the session.
All right, so this is Annie. I'll step in here. Thank you so much, Sabrina and Susan. So I think next we have Chris sharing about the Powered Micromobility Vehicles Committee. Next slide. All right, Chris.
I'm on. Start my video. There we go. Okay. So yeah, I'm Chris Cherry, professor at University of Tennessee, and I'm chair of the Powered Micromobility Vehicles Committee. I'm aiming here to set up the next couple of speakers and talk about what we've worked on over the last year and a half or so. The idea here, the distinction here with the previous committee is that we are really focused on the vehicle. We're focused on what is a micromobility vehicle. We spent a lot of time trying to ask the question where we draw the lines between a small vehicle and a micro vehicle. And the key idea, of course, is we're trying to understand, just like the previous committee, how to develop these definitions, how to test these, and as all of these vehicles come down the line, we want to develop a common framework on which we can develop standards for these. So the committee consists of it's kind of on the vehicle manufacturer heavy side, you might say, because it is really heavily focused on the vehicles themselves. So the typical engineers rather from the micromobility operators, e-bike companies, and so on. We went through the scope keywords. I have this on the bottom just as a way to easily identify what's really important to this committee. The key issue is it's powered. There was a good bit of discussion about whether a bicycle is a form of micromobility, how about a skateboard, and so on. And so we decided to draw the line at powered, and of course we don't disagree with others that think that a bicycle is a form of micromobility, but for this scope, we're looking at powered, okay, just to simplify where we're going. It has to be low speed. We'll talk about what low speed means in the next couple slides. And lightweight, again, these were a lot of consternation and discussion about these terms when we get up to that part, okay? And then last, this is personal ground transportation. So this is not freight. This is not sidewalk drones yet. For now, this is something we could expand or come up with a new committee later, depends on how we decide to go. But for our first stab at this over the last year, we really focused on personal ground transportation. No drones yet, okay? And so our first document was this Sae J3194, and that was a taxonomy document, again, getting at the question of, for example, what is a scooter? You can get a lot of different answers if you ask that question, and other sorts of micromobility. And we tried to, it was an interesting exercise as all these new vehicles came down the line, how they would have fit into our taxonomy, okay? So we've published that document. John MacArthur will talk about that in a moment. And then we have another standard, this J3230, which is a work in progress document. And that's a kinematic standard. So how do we test top speed, braking, acceleration, deceleration, and so on? And we'll hear more details about that in the coming slides. So that's where we are. That's where, and so we're spending a lot of time on the kinematic standards now. And there's other ideas coming down the line, basically big policy questions that need consensus, that need standards. For example, top speed of micromobility is a good one, okay? And so with that, I'm gonna throw it back over to Annie, and I'll be around at the end for questions.
All right, thank you so much. John, why don't you take it from here to walk us through 3194?
Thanks. So like what Susan talked about for their committee, so it's similar to 3163. Our committee decided, and we started about a year and a half ago as a committee, that to start off defining some of the issues that power the micromobility field, and our committee needed to develop a taxonomy and classification of what vehicles will our committee be addressing, looking at in the near term, and then kind of as we build out long term. So we published in November of 2019 a taxonomy and classification of powered micromobility vehicles, and that's J3194. And so, as Chris was kind of talking about, there's a lot of different vehicles, out there. There was, leading up to when we published this, a lot of confusion. What is that on the sidewalk that I see zipping around? How do I describe that? How do I define it? And then how do I regulate it? So we felt that we wanted to create some kind of structure in which both the industry and operators can help define these vehicles, but also that policymakers can kind of turn towards when they write regulations or permits, or that they can kind of more simply define and name some of these vehicles. So our first step was that we need to kind of define that domain, that universe in which we will specifically look at in this technical report. And as you can see from the slide, we chose to look at vehicles in this first go around that are personal, that Chris said, that are low speed. So anything under 30 miles an hour. And the reason we cut off at 30 is that e-bikes are part of this class of vehicles. And currently in the US, there are regulations that define the top speed electric bike as speed pedelec, and that's 28 miles an hour. So we put that as our kind of initial cutoff on speed, and then curb weight. So vehicle under 500 pounds. That's not to say that there are vehicles out there that are low speed that are higher weight, or lower weight vehicles that are higher speed. But we needed to define this in the initial part of this standardization. So we chose this kind of domain. So next slide, please. So the other thing is, Chris said, we kind of were looking initially at personal, but also non-freight. It's not to say that our committee won't be looking at that in future iterations of standards, but here are the 6 classifications of vehicles that we kind of defined. So a powered standing scooter, a powered bike, which is what a lot of people think of as a kind of electric bike or some other powered bike. We wanted to be fuel agnostic in these initial terminologies. Powered self-balancing boards, powered seated scooters, powered self-balancing boards, and powered skates. As if you go into the standard and look at this, we have criteria on how we classify these. So it is done by curb weight, it's done by vehicle width, vehicle speed, and power source. So that somebody could write a definition related to a powered seated scooter as being lightweight, so under 100 pounds, but more than 50 pounds, standard width, which is under 3 feet, low speed, which is between 8 miles an hour and 20 miles an hour, and electric. So these are the ways we present a way of classifying each of these vehicle types. So that's the standard. It's been out since November. We're still getting comments, back on it and how people are using it. And we're really interested in how people are going to be applying this in both, the industry, but also in policy and permits and regulations and in popular press and other ways in which we define these new types of micromobility. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. So let's move to Ryan, who will walk us through our newest standard and development, 3230. Ryan?
Yeah, so Ryan Yee here, and I lead vehicle compliance at Bird. So thank you to SAE, Annie, and Chris in particular for facilitating some of this important standards development work. I think it's also important to recognize some of the other committee members who I think draw from their experience and their roles at Lime, Lyft, and a few other organizations that have contributed to this important work so far. So jumping right in here, really the rationale behind 3230 is to, one, provide practicable vehicle level performance-based metrics to measure performance, as well as provide test methods and conditions for these. Also, I think the third point here is to really provide meaningful metrics for industry, consumers, as well as the public agencies to evaluate safety and performance of powered micromobility vehicles. Next slide, please. So the development of the standard is really largely focused around test procedures and metrics for top speed, acceleration, as well as deceleration and braking. And so as you'd expect, the committee has given consideration to things like initial vehicle conditions. So things like upper bounds on accumulated mileage on the vehicle being tested, as well as things like tire condition and the states of charge of the battery when they're being tested. In addition, we've really thought through things like operator anthropometry and positioning on the vehicle when testing, as you'd expect these criteria to have an important impact on performance that's actually measured on the vehicle. Also important, I think, for repeatable measurements has been a discussion around environmental and test track conditions, as well as conditions that would really consider performance on an incline, because these can be quite important from a safety perspective. Now, in terms of timeline, we're expecting that we'll be able to finalize and publish 3230 by the end of this year. And as a side note, I think the committee has really largely focused the development of this standard in the context of powered standing scooters. But I think as the standard comes closer to being a final draft, the hope is to really see what other vehicle categories the standard might be applied to, as John previously described. Next slide, please. So finally, to give folks a sense of how we've been thinking about things, I thought it might be helpful to describe some of the test scenarios that are being considered as well. So around deceleration, there are primarily 3 test scenarios being considered at this point. As you'd expect, the first one really revolves around nominal braking performance. So when all brakes are present on the vehicle, do they function as expected? The committee has also thought about things like a brake redundancy test. So in scenarios in which a brake potentially fails, what does that mean in terms of braking performance? And finally, we've given some thought around deceleration performance around geofence boundaries. So does that potentially introduce any operator instability at some of these boundary conditions? And so kind of in broad strokes, I think the development of the standard has been moving quite quickly, and I'm really encouraged by the level of collaboration we've seen amongst all the different committee members.
Thank you very much, Ryan. So I think we can move to the next slide. First, Ryan, thank you for emerging out of your vacation to walk us through the standard. So I'm going to shift gears here, and we're going to be looking at Mobility Data Collaborative, which takes form as a consortium rather than a traditional standards development committee. So next slide. To walk us through what we really are, who we are, it is a multi-sector forum where private and public mobility partners gather to really advance the dialogue around mobility data sharing. And next slide. We have a handful of partners. We have operators, nonprofits, academia, data platforms, and trade association, as well as public agencies to gathered together to develop a framework around data sharing. And with that, next slide, I'm going to ask Regina to walk us through one of our first best practices. And then Regina, if you can pass the ball to Greg for the second one, that'd be great.
Great. Well, it's great to be here. And first off, thank you to Annie and ITS America team for having me present as part of this webinar. I think also I just want to say I'm really impressed with a lot of the other work that other committees have been doing. It's great to see so much progress so quickly in what's obviously a rapidly moving mobility space. So as a quick introduction, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Populus. We're a data platform that empowers cities to manage the future of mobility. And we started working with cities in early 2018 to help them analyze data from shared electric scooter companies. We found that a lot of the operating permits define different performance metrics, such as deployed vehicle and vehicle caps in ways that were sometimes inconsistent across cities. And then we also found that many operators didn't interpret the metrics necessarily in the same way. And so that really motivated this first project, which was to help basically develop a glossary that would ensure that cities and operators were speaking the same language when it came to micromobility performance metrics, more from kind of an operating permit point of view. It's pretty simple. It can be really hard to follow the rules if you don't know what the rules are. And also from a city perspective, it's very hard to enforce the rules if you haven't defined them very clearly. So this first project was taken on by Tool Design and Populus, and I'll briefly share those results today. For those of you who don't spend every day thinking about mobility data, the 1-minute background is that when many cities began to adopt mobility permits or micromobility permits, they typically included a requirement for data sharing. And initially, many cities started requiring static historical reports and then GBFS data, the General Bike Share Feed Specification. And later, towards the end of 2018, the Mobility Data Specification was introduced, which made it much easier for cities to access significantly more data from shared scooters and bikes, including all vehicles in the public right-of-way, not just those that were available for consumers to check out, as well as it enabled the sharing of detailed breadcrumb data for trips, including the start, end, and everything in between. If you're interested in a deep dive, we released a new report on that topic in May, a practical guide to mobility data sharing that you can access on our website. Next slide. So what we found is that despite the availability of data standards, what was still missing from the equation for cities and operators were consistent definitions about performance metrics that operators would be held accountable to. So for this SAE project, Tool and Populus primarily focused on those metrics that were readily available through the standards that I just described. And 2 were used as performance metrics to make key decisions about a mobility program, including, for example, should the program continue? Should X, Y, or Z operator be allowed to continue because they were following or not following specific guidelines for a permit, and so forth. Next slide. So the Metrics Glossary, which I encourage you to download and take a look at if you are interested in diving deeper into the details. We purposely designed the guide to be pretty similar to something like an NTD, the National Transit Database Glossary, which covers the following key types of metrics. Vehicle status definitions, so what is the status of a vehicle in the public right-of-way, trip definitions, time definitions, and then probably the more tangible, really important metrics that are often used in permits are the vehicle-based performance metrics. So including specifically how might a city count vehicles towards, for example, a vehicle cap, if there is a vehicle cap, such as each operator has 500 or 1,000 or however many vehicles that they're allowed to deploy in a city. And then trip-based definitions, where we saw a lot of confusion was whether or not a trip that started in one jurisdiction but ended up in another jurisdiction should count when, for example, one was evaluating utilization rate. So in the glossary, we really clearly outline those specific definitions for each of these terms. And in terms of the process, Tool and Populus interviewed about 20 different city operating permits, and those cities We worked with many of the operators that obviously are operating under these permits, developed an initial draft of these terms that we then took back to those cities and operators to solicit feedback. Those terms were refined. We presented them at a workshop at the Transportation Research Board to solicit further feedback, also from regulatory agencies and operators. And then what you can download through the SAE Mobility Data Collaborative website is a culmination of those months of feedback from operators and cities to develop a common understanding of these terms. Appreciate having been involved in this initiative. And now I'm going to pass things over to Greg, who's going to talk a bit more about data and privacy principles.
Great. Thank you, Regina. Next slide, please. So hi, everyone. I hope everyone is staying safe and well, including your families during this challenging time. Again, just want to echo thanking the Mobility on Demand Alliance and SAE for the opportunity to talk about this work that I appreciated leading for the SAE Mobility Data Collaborative. So the work is guidelines focused on governance issues around the sharing of mobility data. As we know, there isn't a day that goes by, I don't think, where we don't hear the word data within the smart mobility space, and reading more and more about how data is being shared, used, and analyzed as we think about the potential long-term opportunities with next generation mobility solutions like micromobility and everything else that we're talking about today. So what I really appreciate about the discussion today is the focus on standards and trying to figure out how do we get everyone on the same page as we're dealing with these complicated and evolving issues. So my name is Greg Rodriguez, as has been mentioned. I'm mobility policy lead at Stantec. In a previous life, I was an attorney representing mainly cities and IPOs on issues around next gen mobility solutions and data sharing. So, you know, when we started the work on this with the collaborative, it was really looking at the problems on this slide and then trying to think of a solution-oriented way to address some of these complicated issues. As I mentioned, you know, things are evolving quickly, and a lot of the projects that are going on in this space don't fit neatly into existing rules and regulations. Next slide, please. So, you know, just to put the guidelines into context, this document is not meant to inhibit data sharing. Instead, it's to focus on coordination, collaboration, and risk mitigation. And, you know, as we stress in the document when you get a chance to read it, and I hope you will download it along with the metrics, is, you know, this isn't any one sector's responsibility. You know, it's a combination of thinking about play a role on this, how does the public and private sector play a role on this, and what are the responsibilities for us to coordinate and collaborate to make sure we get this important part of the equation right. Data is a major focus right now, but in my mind, it's just a tool towards realizing all the opportunities around the future of transportation that we're all excited and inspired by. So when you open the guidelines, what are you going to see? You're going to see the reference to the guideline like you see on this slide. There are 10 of them. Then you're going to see further detail on the objective behind the guideline, and then recommended steps that all sectors can take to support the guideline. We worked very hard to get consensus around the recommendations so that the document can be adopted as a foundation for addressing many of the evolving issues that are coming with data sharing. So some high-level takeaways from the guidelines that I just want to bring up that I welcome the chance to talk about further in the Q&A, but in line with the standards theme of this discussion. One of the opportunities we identified was standardizing the approach to privacy risk assessments as part of a project that's implementing data sharing. So in other words, to do the risk assessment at the outset of a project rather than after the fact. And so that would fall under guideline 2, where we focus on consumer risks. We also identified the need and opportunity to develop training and education around best practices and laws associated with privacy. This falls under guideline 3, focus on being realistic around the ability to anonymize and de-identify data. And I think it also falls under guideline 9 as well, as we think about the contracting element of all this. And also guideline 10, we want to make sure both parties have a clear understanding of the duties and obligations that come with data. And it's more than just a data sharing agreement. It's also thinking about the licensing and ownership of data. Of course, we also identify the need for allocating resources to support the development and maintenance of data governance frameworks. So as laws and best practices modernize, we need to make sure that the data governance frameworks that we're putting in place are also updated and that they're essentially maintained. Kind of think of it from a transit perspective. You're not going to put forward a project unless you have funding to also maintain it as well. In this complicated space, it's important to be thinking about that early on. And then, to really think about how do we develop a consistent approach to public record requests and law enforcement requests for data. This covers 2 separate guidelines under 7 and 8 and is a really important and difficult issue due to the varying laws across the country around public record acts, as many on the phone or on this call likely know and appreciate it. And then finally, focusing on mitigating risks. Again, this is where the contracting element is important in addition to developing a standardized approach to privacy impact assessments so that we reduce the risks for litigation. We really want resources to be focused on projects rather than litigation. And, a big part of this project was acknowledging that who controls the data is a very sensitive issue right now. And this document, doesn't even get into that level of analysis, but instead focuses on a step before that, which we identified, which is focusing on the foundations needed to ensure the safe and responsible sharing and management of mobility data. So I just wanted to provide some quick takeaways that you'll see when you hopefully review and download the guidelines. I look forward to discussing more in the Q&A and also comments for anybody that is reviewing and digesting and hopefully moving towards adopting the guidelines. I know Annie and myself would welcome any feedback as we continue to make sure this document evolves as the way we're using data evolves. So thank you again for the opportunity and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much. Amy, did you want to moderate the Q&A?
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you, and we appreciate that folks have been asking sort of questions as we've been going along, some of which we've been answering, and some of you all can look into the Q&A side and look at a couple of those. And I actually wanted to start with a question that was asked earlier that was directed to Sabrina and Ron. Thank you for your question. It was in regards to equity and to disadvantaged populations and their involvement within the standard setting. And specifically, the question was this, and Sabrina, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about it. And then I know that some of the other members in the panel were interested. As we're starting to see a transition in how USDOT and others think about low income, elderly, those with disabilities, even equity issues, how are the work that we're doing within the committees making an effort to engage different populations, for instance, in the standard setting as we work through this?
Thanks, Amy. So, and I said this to Ron, thank you for the question. I think it's a really important question. And if it's okay, I'd actually like to answer it in 2 ways. One, as the chair of the committee, but also the second way, really, as a provider of transportation services, because I think we have an obligation to do both. So as, from the committee's perspective, we absolutely want to be open and think about developing standards related to accessibility, low income access, all of these other key components. And I think part of what makes our work on the fundamental standards so critical is that it's like speaking a language. Before you can really learn a little bit more sophisticated vocabulary, you have to be able to ensure that you have the basics set. So as we work to develop some of the basic standards on what is mobility on demand, what is digital mobility, that allows us to really move into a world where we can have more sophisticated conversations about the standards that really add the rest of the color to the industry. Now, as a provider, I spend my days having conversations with cities on behalf of ZipCar, answering questions just like that, which is we provide a service. How do we ensure we're reaching all populations, regardless of physical ability, income status, age? That's really something that we as providers have to continue to focus on. For us, it's been a real mix of ensuring that we are polling our members, looking at our demographic data, ensuring that we are in fact representative, listening to our members who have new questions coming up, and then of course working with cities to ensure that they're feeling like our physical presence is appropriate given some of their goals. We at ZipCar really focus on doing that by setting shared goals with individual cities. And we say, what is it that your key goals are for this upcoming permit year? And how can we, using the tools at our resource, really help to accomplish those?
Let me spin that out a little bit more, because I think it's interesting from a practical application piece. And I think you brought up a really good point, that the work that you're doing right now through the committee structure is essentially creating the foundation under which you then layer sort of larger issues such as equity, addressing different population types and the like. But from a practitioner perspective, and I'd open it to all of you guys, are you seeing any kind of consistency in conversation when it comes to different types of populations, like what Sabrina was just talking about? And you know, for instance, addressing low income or senior mobility as it relates to micromobility services, for instance, or even the data collection side on what you're looking at, Regina. I suspect that you may have some clarifications that people are wanting to see about types of populations that you're reaching. Are we seeing some natural evolution already into that? And is there consistency across the different cities? And it relates to another question that we also got, but how are you guys seeing this right now? And maybe I'll ask Ryan or Regina or even Susan or others if you guys are seeing some of that.
I can dive in initially. So I think, you know, when it comes to equity in mobility services, we address that in two different ways. One is that through Populus, we actually gather data through surveys in a representative fashion. And so we're looking at the entire population in major metro areas, wanting to capture survey data from individuals across the economic spectrum, across different ages, and across different racial composition. And we use the census as our main ground truth, because it's the best ground truth that we have, to understand who are using these services. Are there reasons certain populations are not using these services? What do general citizens think of these services when they're introduced, including services like micromobility? I think that sort of qualitative data is really important to gather to understand, you know, who might be being left out when mobility continues to evolve. And then the second piece of that is many cities are also now able to access a lot more data about where these services are being deployed, where they're being made available. And what I will say is that with access to that data, more cities have been effective in crafting equity programs that then specifically prescribe that there need to be a certain portion of vehicles that are made available in communities that they know have been underserved historically. And I think one of the big questions that probably a lot of folks in the industry have is, as we think about the delivery of transportation services, should perhaps some of those services be subsidized? If you look at, for example, public transit, you know, we ensure that we are able to distribute transportation services through, in part, subsidy to make sure that nobody is left behind from those services. And I think similarly with micromobility and other private mobility services, we probably should think about what are the pricing and incentive structures that can enable those services to be made available to everyone who needs them.
Oh, that's really relevant. And Ryan, I don't know if you or Susan or Steve are seeing that in your research or that kind of thing. If people are, I think we often talk about all transportation being local, and so perhaps there's not yet a lot of overlap on that kind of equity planning that you're seeing at the different jurisdictions and city levels. But are you seeing anything at a broad level from a, and I don't mean to overemphasize, but from a standardized process where people are really just sort of hitting it, so it makes it easy also on, or easier for our private mobility providers to partner in that?
So this is Susan. Thanks for the question. You know, I've been looking at this topic for decades, and what I will say is that things are changing and things are improving in terms of seeing the use of these types of modes by a more diverse population. But I will say that, you know, having a bit of more of a critical view, I think we have a lot of work to do. And so there's signs of hope, but I think we need more people at the table. And I'd really encourage us to think about inviting more of these voices to be part of the standardization process, because a lot of the research we've been doing with vulnerable populations in recent years really suggests that many of these people feel left out. and in the research context, many of these people feel like guinea pigs. And to dovetail on what Regina was talking about, subsidies, I think there's a lot of concern in these communities about these services coming in, but not staying very long. And so I think we really do need to start talking about finance when we're talking about these modes overall, but particularly for vulnerable populations. I think one of the worst things we can do is try to offer these services and then pull them back because there's not a sustainable business model. So that's my 2 cents, but I do think there's signs of hope for sure.
Well, I think that there's a lot of conversation to be had on that about creating the public expectation of a service that then disappears and what that really means. And, you know, I often talk about this from a mobility on demand perspective. What is sort of the 2.0 version of MOD? Is it all private sector oriented? We've seen the ebb and flow of that and what it really means in the public-private partnership model later. And how do you think about things like federal funding and others? And we can get into that here in a bit, but we have a couple other questions that I wanted to get into. And just one that was asked about sort of the commonality of standards, and we're gonna push it, Ted. The question was about autonomous vehicles and automated vehicles, and how the SAE standards and taxonomy relate to also other kinds of legislation that talk about standards, if you will, that create definitions, and what the relationships are between sort of the SAE work and how that works in the key definition terms. And what we're going to do on that one, and we're going to have Annie sort of reach out to some of her colleagues so we can do some cross identification about what the overlaps are in those standards, and we'll reach back to you individually on that particular answer. But Ron, you also had another question that was to Regina in regards to jurisdictions doing their own thing. And I think this is inevitably the problem that we have with standards, right? Everyone's out there, they do their very best to do their research of the ecosystem, whether it's reaching to another city and say, hey, how did you contract that? Let me look at your contract. Or, hey, how did you define electric bicycles? Okay, maybe I'm using that. Oh, what do you require for insurance? But the question was to Regina, and especially about the work that you're doing on the data side. How are you looking at outreach so you can develop a higher awareness of all of this so that people actually look and use these standards?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And what we saw in the early micromobility is that there were a few leading cities like Seattle and Washington, D.C., where basically the dockless bikes had landed first. And so they had developed permit structures, and what ended up happening is a lot of cities then kind of cut and paste different pieces that they liked, and then those permits kind of evolved over time. And they weren't necessarily consistent, but there were definitely some commonalities because one of the methods that people were using to develop them was to just look at other permits. I think that broadly, what we're seeing is organizations like NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, has been really effective in bringing together cities to develop common best practices around those permits, and a whole host of issues, including insurance, et cetera, as well as NABSA, the North American Bike Share Association, which also, many scooter and micromobility permits and operators are part of that community. At Populus, and I think one of the things that we've been effective in doing, because we're a data platform that works with a lot of cities and supports them in bringing in that data and then using it effectively, is that we find the vast majority of cities aren't building their own solutions themselves. They're relying on more cost-effective third-party solutions. And so we, by virtue of having adopted those industry standards, are helping to standardize the metrics. So the metrics that we present in our platform are, now the SAE Mobility Data Collaborative metrics. And so we're basically pushing out the consistency by virtue of delivering that technology. But we also do a lot of outreach like these webinars.
So in other words, because you guys are doing good work, you're helping to sort of share the standards as a result of that. It's an interesting parallel. We're doing something similar with the MOD Alliance, and we, as you guys are probably aware, and many of our attendees, we do quite a bit of work in the policy area, and currently for federal reauthorization has been talking a lot about mobility on demand. What is it? How do you define it? What are the protocols? And as we start creating expectations that it become federally funded, to allow for the flexibility for it to be federally funded, for instance, partnerships with our bike share partners or our micromobility partners, or even with our TNC and our ride sourcing partners. Note how I said the word ride sourcing. Crowdsourcing comes directly out of the definitions and the taxonomies that have been created, because I think it's important that people understand what those definitions are. So we've been doing the same and then trying to work those things into policy. I think it's important for us all to be able to do that. You know, another question came in regards to the EU. And so we have a listener, a participant who's at the EU right now and in the EU. And here's the comment. I'm just going to read it and maybe ask Greg and Regina to tackle this. And John, you might even have some thoughts on it as well. That being in the EU, they have very specific guidelines when it comes to their data collection and storage. And we all recognize that data privacy is a significant element of EU standards as well. But an issue that they run in with, especially in the UK, is that local municipalities are still asking for data that falls outside of what seems reasonable when it comes to the guidelines. So how do you manage and balance the collection of data in a world where the standards, where there aren't standards for it and they can't really be collected globally? Maybe Greg, you want to try that, tackle that one?
Sure, I can start, and I'm sure Regina has some experience as well in this space. But, you know, I think, you know, it gets to our overall conversation around how do we do more outreach and education. I know you just asked Regina about that and was the inspiration behind the guidelines. So, you know, how do we help communities even understand what they're asking for and why? And then a big part of the guidelines that, you know, that are in there that we identify too is just an understanding of what is the regulatory framework or best practices associated with the privacy elements that come with the sharing of mobility data. And I think, you know, when you talk about the EU, of course, the EU has the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that is the standard globally around thinking about privacy, not only from a privacy perspective, but also from a consumer perspective. And so there are definitions in that act that relate to what is personally identifiable information. And then you have, you know, in the US, you have California adopting the CCPA, which only uses a definition for personal information. And kind of the key to all this, in my mind, and something we talked about with the collaborative is, you know, what is location data? What is geolocation information? So I think, you know, a lot of municipalities are very rightfully excited about the opportunity with data and having this data to have this whole new tool for transportation planning. And we should want to promote that, but we need to be conscious of there are risks that come with the data, especially with the long term. One of the things that I've been focused on as a practitioner is really thinking about, if we don't get the privacy right, then my fear is that users will stop sharing their data and we lose the opportunity to use this tool. So kind of you know, I appreciate the question. And I think, you know, it's not only thinking about standards from a national perspective, how do we also think globally, which I know, you know, ITS America is very focused on and MODA is very focused on as well.
Right, and I think you're right, you know, in regards to sort of the privacy side and how that plays itself out. And then there is this question about jurisdictions, and I'm guilty of it, having been in the public sector as well, you know, that the overreach. I just want it all, or I want these things, and maybe not always an understanding and knowing what I'm asking for. And it's a difficult thing to push back and to say no. We recognize the issues when you start asking for a lot are fraught with issues in regards to, say, privacy and some of the challenges that we're seeing right now, for instance, in the MDS specifications. And so I'm curious, you know, with our other partners like Ryan, for instance, from a perspective, Bert, you know, how do you respond when you have that, you know, well-meaning but overreaching municipalities who just simply want too much?
Yeah. So I think, yeah, I mean, I might not be the right person to answer this question because, you know, my world revolves around vehicle compliance and technical standards development. But yeah, I mean, maybe this is worth a separate discussion.
Yeah.
I can dive in a little bit if it's helpful.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I've seen that there are two kind of key issues related to data sharing in Europe. One is that most European cities aren't using MDS, and so there are actually lots of bespoke requests that are happening around data. I generally view myself as very pro standard, but standards agnostic. But I do think it's easier for everyone in the community on the city side, but also on the operator side when there are consistent standards. So I think that is a challenge right now in the European landscape. And so I'm sure there are some standards that are, or some asks of data that perhaps are asking for too much, and then there are some that are asking for less, but one general issue is they're not all the same. And then the second is related to GDPR, and Greg provided a great overview. Populus has become GDPR compliant because we do work outside of the United States. And I think the key questions that everyone needs to ask themselves are we being responsible about who is allowed to host data, store data, what specific procedures are in place to ensure that's protected, what are the specific use cases for the data, and do the city asks and how Populus as a platform or other platforms are processing that data, are we adhering to those global policies? And I think we're going to see a similar evolution in the United States. We're just a few steps behind, but with CCPA, I mean, it is very similar to GDPR in that it is starting to put in place broader privacy frameworks that protect personal information, including geolocation data.
Yeah, and we have a question that came in, and I maybe asked that we pull it offline because I have a question for our colleagues related to the vehicles themselves, since I put you on the spot, Ryan. But question about what are specific actions that states could take that would add value, for instance, to this industry? You know, how could you set a regulatory floor, for instance, but still allow local communities to tailor what they need for their programs? But, you know, questions about sort of the next steps with micromobility standards and the vehicle standards, and sort of what are the next steps, Chris and John and Ryan. And I'm going to twist it a little bit because safety is such a big piece to this. And it comes up certainly on a policy perspective is how can people from a regulatory perspective prescribe better safety when it comes to the micromobility industry, and how do those standards and the next steps that you guys are doing maybe apply in that practical application of the safety as people start thinking about it from a policy side? And is there anything they should be regulating?
Yeah. So I guess I can take that. That's kind of more in my wheelhouse. But I think that
a good one. You know?
Yeah. So I think you know, a safety standard or a performance standard ultimately can be quite related. I think the intent of you know, for example, J3230 is to really provide kind of a common framework for measuring performance, which, as you could imagine, could ultimately have some correlation to safety. So, for example, there could be things like rider stability, potential for injury, and straight line braking performance that may all be related in some way, but at this current kind of time, I don't think there's kind of a common framework across geographies to actually measure performance. And so I think that that's kind of the intent behind this standard.
And I'll jump in too while I can. I've got a hard stop in 2 minutes, but the same sort of idea is that, you know, with the e-bike front runners, they essentially said that there was a classification that was a common language across what an e-bike is, and therefore states could actually regulate different classes of e-bikes efficiently and effectively. That gave very clear signals to industry, of course, on what they could and couldn't build, and who was in and who was out is another way to think about it. And so I think with our standard, I think it's very important that a state, probably at the state level, would say, this is what a scooter is. A stand-on scooter is this thing. A sit-on scooter is this thing, this other thing, and it's all reference back to the SAE standards. And then top speed, as measured by our next standard, is 20 miles per hour. And if a vehicle meets those standards, then they're compliant and they can come into the market. And I think that just gives clarity. So it's important that all the states adopt basically common language, for example, on what a scooter is. And I think that's where we've gone.
Yeah, and I think you're starting to see that across the states. And go ahead, John. You wanted to
I just wanted to jump in real quick and say that I think one of the most important things is for states, cities to be involved in this standard process. Maybe not on the day, like the making of the standards. I mean, in some cases that are very technical, but at least saying what they need to help them grow and use this whole both shared mobility and micromobility. So particularly on the terms and classifications, is that they use them, they try to use them, they give feedback, so we can evolve them. But also, it's if they're having issues that of concerns about safety and wanting, powered self-balancing boards to be more safe because they feel that they are a hazard or having issues, come talk to the industry, talk to SAE to say, what can we do to help standardize this? We're having a hard time putting a permit in or regulations. So really getting engaged in this community, which I think typically they don't feel that they can engage. And I think both on the data platforms side, but also on these standards for micromobility and shared mobility.
I think, John, that's a great way of sort of wrapping us up, because part of what the intent of this webinar even was to do was to more broadly share some of what is happening within the SAC standards development, how it's really advancing the industry, the ecosystem, and frankly, how people can continue to get involved in it. It's a robust process, but how do we make sure that it then permeates itself through our cities, the implementation, our policy development, both at the city, the state, and the federal level. And the next one, I have to say, will be all about urban air mobility. I can't wait to hear how we create shared mobility standards for things that pick you up and fly away. So Annie, listen, and team, I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Someone has asked whether or not the recording of this webinar would be provided, and we're going to work to get that out and available for people. Annie also placed in the chat box a variety of different links to the different programs that SAE is implementing. And, on behalf of the Mobility on Demand Alliance, I just wanted to thank our partners with SAE for taking the time to join us. And perhaps we have this conversation again as the work continues. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.